Hey everyone, it's PL Stewart here, and I'm back with another episode of Six Elemental Interviews today. This is somewhat of a marathon. We have interviews with three absolutely fabulous creatives today, all kind of in a row. This is the second of three, and today I have the marvelous author, Jason Shannon, author of The Hounds of Harujin. The Hounds of Harujin is a book that totally blew me away, took me by surprise, ended up being in my top reads of the year. Check out that post on Before We Go blog. I think people can tell from the caliber of books on that list. If any of you haven't heard of Jason Shannon or read his work, you need to do so, because believe me, again, I was blown away, and it was one of my, I have to admit, surprise top books of the year. Now I know that Jason's going to be a must-buy author after reading everything he writes. I fully anticipate we're going to see some more of his books make my top 10 reads. So quickly, I'll just give Jason a chance to say hello and introduce himself. Jason, welcome to the channel.
Well, thank you, PL, for having me, and thank you for all your kind words. I mean, it's always nice to hear a fellow author or just a reader in general give me a compliment to say that I made your top 10 list. But yes, I am Jason Shannon. I'm the author of 6 novels now and counting. The Hounds of Harujin being my heftiest, bulkiest one. This is volume 1, which we're going to be discussing today. And I also have many other books that are completely different in tone, in length, in style. Even I'm kind of branching out into different genres right now. And I'm just looking forward to having a good chat today.
Yeah, and I'm so thankful and grateful that you're joining me today. Thank you again so much, Jason. I have the utmost respect for you as an author, as a person. We've had the opportunity to meet in person. That's how we first met at a book fair. And, it's funny how I'm not sure if you've had the experience. Clearly, we're all authors, and we love to read, and we respect each other and each other's works. But frankly, you never know what you're going to get when you meet someone and you do a book exchange. You don't know if their book's going to jive with you. It may be a fantastic book, but it's just not to your taste. But boy, was Hounds of Harujin to my taste. Was it ever fabulous? This book, again, a book I can't stop thinking about. I feel like this book is unique in so many ways. And what you do with this book, and I'm going to let you talk a lot about your book in your own words. You essentially take the real world legacy of these infamous Mongolian conquerors like Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan, and you bequeath that legacy to this new fictional, infamous titular, Harujin, and it's set in like almost a post-apocalyptic dystopian, at least certainly a future world where it seems like things are on the verge of an energy crisis and economic collapse, as you say in your synopsis for the book, and that this Harujin, is helping to usher in a new world order. Again, as the synopsis said. Can you tell me in your own words, what The Hounds of Harujin is about?
Yeah, so basically, as you said, there's these various Mongolian, or more accurately, the steppe conquerors that show up through history. Genghis Khan, and forgive me for using the more anglicized Western pronunciation. Genghis Khan is the most infamous of them, but there's also Attila the Hun, who was nomadic and probably or possibly from that general area in Mongolia at the fall of Rome. And also Tamerlane, from sort of the national hero of Uzbekistan, who forged his own empire very much in the light of Genghis Khan, as well as many others like Babur and Nurhaci. And they form these sort of Central Asian dynasties that are steeped in blood and conquest and death and sort of mass destruction. And in many ways, it is sort of a clash of civilizations, from the sort of the nomadic herding cultures up to the more settled, usually walled societies that have a lot more material wealth, but have a more less, or I should say, like a less warrior-like culture is a good way of putting it. And these come about every so often, and did right up until kind of the beginning of like the automatic machine gun, which really allowed the West and just more settled societies to kind of stop these nascent insurrections in their path. And I just kind of wanted to create something new. Like, this is Genghis Khan was not a one-off. He was just the sort of the most well-known, the most bloody of them all. I'm like, I could do this again. I've always liked post-apocalyptic fiction. I do sort of class this as post-apocalyptic, as you mentioned, although it does veer into like a fantasy like territory. And so I just kind of recreated that, where I have this new fictional conqueror by the name of Harujin, and he comes about kind of as our dynasty, our world order is coming to an end, and forges his own empire. And my cat is butting in here, but and yeah, so I kind of went from there. I did not intend it to be as long as it is when I began writing it. I thought it was going to be like a bit of a, slightly longer than the average novel. Wound up being about 1,200 pages. Because right from the beginning, or from about 2 weeks in, I knew how it was going to end. And I knew that there's a lot of characters that all kind of have to fall into place. This takes place over the course of an entire continent, over about 6 months. And they're all riding horses or camels or walking on foot to get to and from different places. So I knew where the characters had to line up and how certain characters had to be in certain locations. And then it wound up just kind of going and going and going and going until I hit 1,200 pages and became this epic thing. And so, yeah, it was very much like I was kind of learning on the fly as I went with this one. And I'm quite happy with how it turned out. I think you're still
Sorry,
muted.
I'm still muted. I apologize. And I'm going to quickly put up a comment, someone who's joined us here. So good day, Central Salamander. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate you coming on to see Jason chat to me today. And Central Salamander says the chat GTP description of Jason as an author starts calling him Shannon after list of socials and merchants. I will not be calling him Shannon unless there's far too much tequila involved.
Yeah, that sounds like something that ChatGPT would spit out.
Yeah, I'm assuming that this is, again, depending on who you are, Central Salamander, regardless, we always put comments up of anyone who joins. So, we're gonna leave that there. Thank you very much, though, for joining. So, this book, Hounds of Harujin, is absolutely epic in scope. But it's not just epic in scope. You have done a ponderous, and I have to say, from what I can see, and I'm a history nerd and a history buff, but my area of expertise does not lie in the periods in which you research. But from what I can see, I have a general knowledge of it, of course, but you have done absolutely impeccable and quite extensive research into the period of those conquerors who are precursors to your Harujin, the Genghis Khans, etc., as you mentioned. And this is complete with detailed appendices, the footnotes that make references to the real life Mongolian and steppe conquerors. I mean, this is the work you put into this, Jason, is absolutely astounding. It's on a level that I rarely see in fantasy to link your fantastical fictional world to its real world history. Like, how much work did you do to make this volume? It's fantastic, but how much work did you do to get all that done?
It was quite a bit. I was lucky in some sense, because if you just casually look up Mongolian history, you're not going to find a whole lot. You're going to find a few maybe History Channel specials, which get a lot of details wrong, or just, merge years, or things that might be years apart, merge them into one sentence. And then once you start researching some of the unanswered questions as to, did this battle actually take place, or did it happen here, or who is this daughter of the Khan that gets mentioned here, because different sources will say different things. Once you start down that path, very soon you find yourself in like the Cambridge History of China or other very academic, lesser circulated periodicals and whatnot. And so you really have to dive in deep if you want to have any sort of a cursory glance. And in particular, I have the appendices at the end, which are quite lengthy, and one of them is on Tengriism, the sort of the Mongol shamanic religion. And that was the one that really made me decide I had to include those appendices in there, because if you just try to casually look that up, if you're a reader who comes to my work and is like, he's referencing all these different spirits, but who are they? What do they do? What is the basis of this religion all about? If you just Google it, you're either not going to find the right answer. You're going to find something that's so minimal and simultaneously so wrong that you're still going to be left not knowing what I'm going on about. And so from there, I kind of had to build out and include these appendices, so at least you have some reference as to what I'm going on about. And once you start down that path, I was very lucky that there are PhD'd Mongol or Central Asian history professors. There's only a few of them in the English-speaking world, and they're very happy to converse with you. And I email them saying, "Oh, in this book, there's a footnote here that kind of hints to this, but I wonder if you had more context." And someone will just share complete PDF libraries with me of translations done over the years or over the decades. Or they'll say, "Oh, check with this other professor because he might know this," and then they share more. And so it was very much a treasure trove. I have to give thanks to those professors, Christopher Atwood and George Lane in particular, who were just happy to reach out and chat and provide me with all these resources. And then, of course, I'm enough of a history buff that once I have these resources, I can just dive in and seek the answers to the various questions I had.
Well, I have to say, and I know you're very modest, but Jason, if I hadn't met you in person and I hadn't known that you said up front that you weren't an academic, a scholar, a professor of specifically with expertise in that period, if I just picked up the book and read it, and you very, again, you're very humble, and you make reference to the professors, the scholars say this, the academics say this, I would have thought you were one of them. I would have thought that you did have a doctorate in this specific period in terms of history, a degree in history in this specific period, because that's the level of gravitas you bring to the research that you've done. And I mean, it is simply outstanding. And I'm wondering for you, I'm wondering, have you ever seen or read a fantasy novel, with a pseudo historical background linked to like your own? And was there any inspiration for you, if so, in you writing this?
Kind of, yeah. So one of the sort of inspirations that really got me interested in the Mongols in particular is a series of books by a British author named Con Iggulden, or Iggulden. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. And it's a historical fiction, so he's trying to retell the actual history of the Mongol Empire there. But of course, he's taking liberties, and there's a lot of different princes and nephews that he merges into one or two characters for the sake of narrative. And he tells a really riveting tale. I happened to pick up just one of the books in the series and was fascinated by it. But then at the end, he has this sort of author's note to say, like, I took liberties here, and the real battle happened here, and I did this, and so on. And he doesn't go into quite the amount of detail that I do, but he kind of really set out the inspiration for me to be like, I have to provide context to the things I'm talking about, even though he's telling actual history and I'm writing something that is in the future. There's so many references and cultural and linguistic references back to the actual Mongol Empire that I'm like, I have to have some accompanying piece in the book where the reader doesn't need to stray too far to try and research a question they might have. Also, I should add that, as I'm sure you've noticed, my writing style is very non-expositional, where I don't like to just take a break from the action and write for pages on end explaining who this character is. Or I mean, in real life, we don't do this. If you and I are chatting now, I'm not going to take a break and turn to the camera there and be like, by the way, my ancestor 13 generations before, and go on for a page and a half about that. So I tend not to do that in my writing itself, but then I still need some basis of context so that if the reader is reading the dialogue being spoken or the narrative being read, then they have some idea as to where to go and find the context.
Yes, and I must say, if I was going to, we're always looking for, and unfairly, I think it's just human nature, and as readers and authors, we're always looking for comparators when we read certain authors. And in that same aspect, you just mentioned about how you write and the fact that you don't, you kind of, I don't want to say you throw the reader into the deep end, but you definitely don't hold their hand, and but yet that certainly doesn't detract from how immersive, incredibly immersive your world is and your writing is. And it reminds me of, I want to mention two brilliant and quite famous Canadian authors, R. Scott Bakker and Stephen Erickson, the author of Stephen Erickson, the author, of course, of the Malazan Book of the Fallen series, and R. Scott Bakker of the Second Apocalypse / Prince of Nothing series. In that, yep, you know what? You're going to get in there, you're going to be immersed, but there's times you can be like, okay, how does this relate? Who's this character? Where did, and then, but it all becomes clear in the end. But at first, you might find a bit of a fog, and it's not a criticism at all. It's just that there's a large character list. There is a huge backstory and history, of course, and lore accompanying, and of course, there's the element of the real historical lore, and then there's the lore that's happened within the generations just prior to the characters, in the current book. So it is fabulous. It's so well done, and I think what the benefit of your style is, your pacing is impeccable. I think in your novel, and you're just so you get caught up sometimes so much in the action, and you realize, but yet you've had all this lore, imbued into you, because there is some, and the footnotes is where I think it really got me, because, and a lot of your footnotes were just hilarious, absolutely, just, it's just so funny. But yeah, like it just, it was just fantastic in that, you dumped us, you threw us in there, and but at the end of the day, you came out, I believe, in my head, I felt I had this compendium of knowledge that I didn't have before about the real historical period involving these Mongolian steppe leaders through everything that you put in the footnotes, everything that you put in what exposition you did have, of course, what the characters are saying and the dialogue. Like, it was just phenomenal. And I will add this comment that these books are a fascinating wealth of information and historical reference. Considering as being a work of futuristic alternative Earth fiction, it allows for entertainment and education via proxy. I must say that is extremely well said. That is extremely accurate regarding your work, Jason. So yeah, it was just simply phenomenal. I want to mention, because again, when we talk about comparisons to your work, another author friend of mine, Stephen Arian, he's written a series, Night on the Falcon, the first book with Judas Blossom. His series, I think his starts focusing with Temujin Khan. So again, it's historical fiction. Obviously, there's a lot of liberties, and characters are combined, as you said, with other works you've read. But again, another phenomenal series. But I was looking for series when I tell people about your book. Obviously, we as authors and readers, we do look for these comparators. So I was trying to say, hey, if you like this, you're really going to love Jason's works. And that was another one of the series that I have been referring people to when they want to know, well, why they should read your work. But again, just absolutely outstanding. So so I want, if you will, I want to get into the book itself, more to the minutia and the characters, etc. So when it comes to the story and the plot itself, without giving away spoilers, in your own words, can you give us kind of an overview of the plot, like what actually happens in the book?
Yeah, for sure. So just for clarity's sake for the listeners, we've been kind of holding up these giant tomes here, both of us. This is volume 1 of 2 in total. And I wrote the entire thing as one book all together and then released them both at the same time. So just that's a note for context. And you've only read volume 1, so I definitely won't get into spoilers. But the idea is that sort of a new Mongol conqueror comes about in our future. We're kind of dealing with like peak oil and economic collapse, and just kind of any excuse to bring us back to not relying on internal combustion engines. And now we're back to riding horses and using bow and arrows. And Harujin and his descendants wind up conquering the entire world. And very much in the sort of cultural tradition of the Mongols, the world then gets divided into these four khanates, which are basically provinces or sort of sub-empires, which is, again, very much what Genghis Khan himself did with his sons. And to keep it somewhat limited in scope, I have it take place in the smallest of the khanates in Australia, New Zealand, the sort of the Pacific Isles, which is still a tremendous feat to do because Australia is a very large country. And then there's, we're into the third or fourth generation where there's more princes and more sort of illegitimate offspring that come about, each wanting their own power, and different generals. And the Empress concubine, who we haven't gotten into, is kind of this Australian woman who's the Khan's favorite concubine and has kind of wrapped her own claws into the dynasty and is trying to steer things in her own way. But the book begins with an assassination of this sort of minor lord who is also not a very good guy, and nobody really likes him, whether the public or the aristocracy. And it kind of goes from there. On the back of that, that's in the prologue. And from there, we get this shamanic series of events that happen in the first few chapters, which was my way of kind of tying together all the various unconnected chapters as I first wrote them, was saying there is a prophecy or a dire sort of futuristic warning that has come in to the capital, directly to the Khan, seemingly regarding the assassination. And all the early chapters are kind of coming back to this, where people are worried about it, people are disbelieving it. There are common people who are, way away from the Mongol centers of power, who are having sort of shamanic experiences, which are suddenly more powerful than anything they've experienced before, and referencing the Red Raven being this sort of omen that gets delivered, which is very vague in and of itself. And so basically you're dealing with a dire shamanic prophecy. You have this political assassin running around. You have the court reeling from this. You have the Empress concubine pulling her own levers of power. The Khan himself is in seclusion, and kind of brings himself semi out of seclusion to bring back his eldest son, who is kind of an outcast, and kind of has to solve the case of this murder to satisfy the Khan's sister, who is the mother of the guy who was killed.
Yeah, that's a great synopsis. Now, in all of this, right, and you highlighted some of the fascinating characters that are involved in this book. So you have this estranged son, Prince, essentially, and he's been he's subscribed to this monastic life. He's separated himself from the court. But he's still very extremely savvy politically. He's very dynamic, and of all the people they chose to solve this murder, they want him to come back and be the one to do it. And what I found the most interesting about his character was that, he chosen this life. He's chosen in many ways to segment himself from the court, and yet, of course, the minute he gets back into the court, he sets himself up. There's a lot of political machinations there's side elements of things that he's investigating that may or may not be necessarily germane to the murder. But in terms of him evaluating his own family and what their potential involvement could be, and or in general, what their political usefulness could be. There's a lot of back dealing. He also quickly realizes that, he's lived this monastic type life, but now he's back in court. He's susceptible as anyone, being a human being, now to loving the trappings and the privileges of being a prince, including having his own concubines, etc. Whereas before he was living this very, this very, again, monastic, celibate type life. He has a strong bond with his sister, who is in a way sometimes one way outside the court too. he's got this complicated relationship with the Khan, and the Khan himself, clearly, although it seems that all he cares about is sleeping with his concubines and is totally obsessed with just the sex and just lock himself away, essentially this hedonistic type. It seems like he's abdicated his running of the kingdom and his responsibilities there to just sleep with his concubines. But really and truly, he's very much paying attention in his mind to the grand scope, the grand scope of the prophecy, whether or not, he is worried about the destruction of essentially his empire. And he feels that it's critical that this murder be solved for various reasons. Again, I try not to get into spoilers here, but he feels it's critical. He brings back, this character to help solve it. And I just wonder, there's so much going on there, and it's fantastically done. Like the intricacy of the political machinations, I absolutely love that. It is definitely on, may I dare say, George R. R. Martin type level. And that's one of the things I love about the book, that the Song of Ice and Fire, that level of sophistication with the political scheming and the different characters and the jockeying for position and power. Was that purposeful? Because I mean, clearly, the historical figures, the Genghis Khans, etc., that was a big part of their lives, right? They came from in some cases very lowly positions and minor chieftain type positions, and they rose to become these mega conquerors. Was that purposeful? Was that definitely something you want to portray in your novel?
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for the connection there to George R. R. Martin. I'm not going to shy away from saying that George is a big inspiration on this, the grand scope that he's able to bring. And I structure my chapters in a similar way to his, where you have this sort of limited fixed POV with different characters, and it changes chapter by chapter, which allows you to, one, get into the minds of these individual characters, but also show sort of the grand scale of the Khanate itself and events happening in Alice Springs versus in Sydney versus in Perth. The prince that you're referencing, Tamerlane, the Khan's eldest, and that whole sort of motive for bringing him into this is ostensibly to solve the murder. And I kind of use the murder and the assassination as this inciting incident to kick off the prophecy anyway. But clearly you get established that the Khan and Tamerlane himself are less concerned with the murder of this one nobleman who, as I mentioned, nobody really likes. And they have to kind of solve the murder for face and for the stability of the Khanate, but they don't really care about him. And but it's really just this way of bringing in this larger shamanic element where there are visions of the future and things are not looking good on the horizon. But of course, interpreting these events is a very difficult thing. And the chief shaman who sends the omen initially is so vague and so he really spends more time in the other world than he does in this one, and doesn't really know how to communicate that back that much anymore. And so both the Khan and Tamerlane are like, yes, you're here for this. We want you to solve this murder, but realistically, figure out what is going on. And Tamerlane, of course, only comes back because he tests kind of the waters of the spirit realm himself, and is like, yeah, there's definitely something going on here, and I should go back for this. He is living at like a Buddhist monastery out in the very, very rural Australian desert. His preachers, teachers, Buddhist advisors even tell him, like, don't go back. Like, it's just a world of corruption and privilege and whatnot. But he is like, no, I have to see what is happening here. And so all of the political moves that you see him make are not really for his own gain, although of course he benefits from them. They are more for like testing the strictures of the society to see where the weak points are, to see what this prophecy is going to lead to and what's going to come of that. But of course, then he has to also go and try to solve this murder.
Yeah, and I found that so well done. And in that though, and there's so many subplots we could delve into. So in this backdrop, you have members of his own family. So you have the nominal heir to the throne who has his own agenda. He in some ways he seems very capable. but he definitely has some issues he's got to cope with. And there's him. Then there's a female princess, a part of the family, who seems to be, again, almost like the Khan. She seems obsessed with having, affairs, and she's in love with one particular individual, lower individual in terms of the social hierarchy, but someone she's actually in love with. But normally she just seems, to want to go out there and have affairs and have all these involvements, and is criticized for that. There's definitely that double standard where, the females, their virtue is prized in a different way versus the males. The males can have as many many relations as they want, but the women are seen, okay, well, you're slack, or etc., if you have all these relationships. And you also have, in this, with all of these other more minor princes, etc., noble people, you have people like the general that comes out to convince the prince to get involved, to come back and solve the murder. You have the empress concubine, who, as you noted, definitely seems to want to, refuses to not play a role in the overall running of the kingdom. You have all these players that, you have advisors, you have people who are all, you even have, sorry, and I'm going backwards here, and I'm rambling. Part of the complications of the court is that 90% of the people in the court, be they part of the royal family, guards, they're all related, because the members of the royal court have been have all these relationships and breeding all of these children and grandchildren, who now later on could potentially be their partners. There's also a level of potential incest that is there. If you meet someone, get involved with someone in the court, they could be a brother, a sister, a cousin, etc., right? Because of all of the proliferation of affairs and concubines, and so it's very, makes things very complicated, right? Mm-hmm. So for example, there's a senior warrior, like a guard commander, that the prince who's called himself the murderer, that could potentially be his sister, and she's jockeyed for position, and she's willing to, she's quite willing to sleep clearly with the prince, who could be her brother, like a half brother. Yeah, like it makes for a very extremely interesting but complicated and convoluted bloodline in terms of who you trust, who you get involved with, who you're sleeping with, because it could be a relative. I found that absolutely fascinating. Was that purposeful as well, that you put that into the work?
Yeah, in some ways that was kind of an extension of a few things. So in my writing, I've done this here, and I've done this in a few other books too, where I will just dial it up to an 11. And I think as I was writing this book, or shortly thereafter, there was the Netflix series Marco Polo with Benedict Wong playing Kublai Khan. And they kind of do the same thing there, where they just take like the concubine harem scenes and take it, to a Netflix degree. And I do the same thing, where it's just, the Khan has like thousands of concubines. There's a whole administrative bureau set up to deal with them, to keep them clothed and fed and housed. And sometimes they don't even meet their lord. Sometimes they just sign their name, they get this government stipend, and then they're given basically a hotel suite until the Khan decides to retire them, which they may never meet him. But when he does, see his concubines, then there's a lot of children that get born, which are, for lack of a better term, bastards. The term actually used in the book is taiji, which is more or less like a non-noble princeling, which is true to Mongolian history. That sort of the noble-born first 4 princes from your empress are the ones who inherit your kingdom, and the rest are just kind of noblemen. They can serve in your military, but they're not really entitled to anything. But then add on top of that the fact that the way Genghis Khan set it up is very much a merit-based society, where if you have enough of a sort of skill in generalship or in war, then you can become more or less a warlord, and you can be promoted, or you can seize power for yourself. And so there's these kind of dueling threads of nobility versus merit that interweave through the latter years of the Mongol Empire. And I'm trying to show that in here as well, where yes, you have this sort of status of the prince, the official prince, the heir apparent, and then you have these other semi-noble children who are trying to distinguish themselves in such a way that they can become more than just, someone on the dole receiving a government stipend and never rising above that station. And so in the case of the guard commander who's trying to potentially sleep with the man who may be her stepbrother, that's her way of being like, well, this guy clearly has enough gravitas, enough power that he could be going places, and I want to ingratiate myself with him in essentially whatever way she can. And so that's where that comes in.
Yeah, and again, I found that fascinating. It added such a layer of intrigue to the entire thing. I was saying, and of course, the realism of that, as you said, this is how things happened in those empires, in those real, steeper Mongolian empires, and what the emperors and the leaders tended to do. But yet, in all of this, we're only scratching the surface of what's actually going on, because you delve into, let's talk about the assassin, for example, and all of the people associated with him, which have entirely different subplots. They're all interconnected, of course, to the court intrigue action, right? So you have the assassin who has links to other main characters, and these characters have their own perspectives. There's a big undertone of magic and prophecy, and a magic that seems disconnected from the magic that we're talking about with the prophecy in the court. You have characters who can wield that magic. You have characters who are, on their own micro level, involved in all kinds of intrigues, vying and jockeying for power. You have characters who are obsessed with other characters, and they're trying to form relationships with those characters. You have characters that are trying to force themselves on other characters. You have, the world you give us from every layer in society. You give us from the top and the court intrigue and the people who actually decision makers and the power brokers, down to what would seem to be the bottom. Although they're playing a role, they're playing a role. Yeah. But can we talk about some of those characters, including the assassin and all those people associated with him, who do play a critical role in the book, but they're not directly in the court, at least not now. Some of them will be in the future because of what they plan to do. But can you talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I should mention that when I write something, particularly of a novel length, and particularly of this length, although this is the first and only time I've done something of this quite length, I need something more than just sword fights and concubines to tie it all together. There has to be a reason why I keep coming back day after day or week after week to write the next chapter or research the next Yale University Press translation of something. And so some of the themes that I put in here that run throughout the entire book are sort of nihilism, which ties very much into the assassin. His name is Kellen. And when he first returns to his sort of base of operations, and there's an event that's happened that's kind of upset his little community, which he spends a good portion of the rest of volume 1 trying to move on from, or pick up the pieces from, or deliver messages to people that were previously a part of that community. And sort of the theme of just sort of meaninglessness or nihilism keeps coming up for him, or he keeps brushing on it a little bit. And then pair that with another major character, Courtney, who's in South Australia, who has her own connections to sort of the spirit realm and is doing these shamanic rituals. She's very young. She is coming from an Australian background. She's living in a region where there's virtually no Mongol presence because of reasons that will become apparent later on. But nonetheless, she is, investigating this shamanic spiritualism, and then has her own sort of vision of dire things in one of the early chapters. And so she gets tied in with another major theme, which is fatalism, where the idea that kind of everything is predestined, that the future is already written, that all you're doing is leading yourself towards this predetermined fate. And then there's kind of questions about like, well, where does free will fit into this? How do you actually move towards this? Are you a failure to the gods if you don't complete this? If you try to rebel against it? It's funny, if I can diverge for a second here, when I released the first 5 chapters plus the prologue in audio as well as in PDF in preparation for this interview. So you can check that on my website. But that allowed me to go back and actually read the first 5 chapters, which I haven't done in about 6 or 7 years. And there's a bit in there where the heir apparent is talking with his favorite concubine about this omen that's been delivered in one of the early chapters. And he asks her, do you believe in fate, my dear? Because there's all this chatter about this shaman delivering this thing. And she playfully answers that she takes a position in rebellion to fate, which of course he likes because it's very playful and the kind of thing you'd want a concubine to say. But then he says, like, well, how exactly does one do that? And she answers, well, in theory only, which kind of, I was just surprised to discover that line was in there. I'm glad I put it in so early, but it is this nice way of setting up that some of the characters are going to be in conflict with fate in the course of this novel. And so some of these themes get tied in to the characters and drive the story forward. In the case of Kellen, the assassin, basically he is him and his group are living kind of on the outskirts, the very rural, is more or less like the very edge of the massive Australian desert, kind of very, if you look at a map of Western Australia, it's kind of right where the grassland and the roads end. And he kind of goes in right into like just the abyss there. And they are, holdouts. They don't like the fact that they're living in this conquest dynasty. They're trying to right the wrongs of the past. Some of them have ambitions a little bit too big for themselves, and there's some failures along the way. And I thought that him and characters like him would be a very real portrait of this future society where you're living under the boot heel of some invading conqueror. Of course, there's going to be resistance to it. They were all kind of born under this boot heel, but it's very recent in the past. It would be like if the Nazis invaded us and we have the swastika flag flying for the next 15 years. There's still going to be resistance, and even young people coming up under that are going to have resistance to it. So I thought that was a very realistic thing to put in. And also, I just like the idea of writing about this sort of badass assassin who's out there with mad bow skills. And yeah.
Yeah, and I loved all those chapters about essentially the regular people, the average people who are trying to go to the bar and pick up at night, and who are battling with racism and prejudice in their communities. There's this push and pull between being a true-blooded Mongol, being badass and cool versus they're savages, and you know what I mean. And I love that interplay. You have one character in particular who, I mean, all your characters are fascinating. You have one character in particular where he's trying to make it. He's trying to be that hardcore warrior, but yet he's too preoccupied with trying to pick up women. He's a deadbeat dad. But yet he goes off on this essentially this quest, and he's obsessed with this one particular woman who herself is quite the formal warrior and infamous in the context of their of their neck of the woods. And he embarks on this quest, and it ends up getting a lot more than he bargained for. When he finally meets her, and I found that whole subplot to be just like I couldn't turn away. Like I kind of despised this character at first, but then the more his POVs came up, the more I look forward to them. Right, because of the relationship was forming and everything else, and I just found it fascinating and found myself worrying about him when he was in danger. And I think that's masterful writing on your part. You have this ability to depict characters that even if they're unlikable, the reader can still identify and still find something to like about them and root for them, which I think is the sign of a brilliant writer. So kudos to that. But yeah. Can you talk a bit about that specific subplot? Because for me, that was one of the highlights of the book. This subplot, it was fantastic.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, that's Adam you're referring to. He's kind of a cohort of Kellen, so he's a part of this holdout community on the edge of the desert. Who there's a group of 5, 6, 7, 8 of them who are these sort of vigilante assassins going out, and we see in the prologue there Kellen goes to kill this this unliked noble, but that's not their normal target. They're normally going after these minor officials who, not just because they're officials, but because they're corrupt, they're taking money on the side, they're not issuing receipts and then claiming, taxes were never paid, or they're, sort of roadside assailants who are, bandits with an official pass. Or they go after bandits, or they go after just kind of anyone who deserves it. You can kind of picture Batman, but a much more like gruesome version of it. And they're living in this more or less innocent community, which is kind of running an orphanage and having these orphan children brought up. So you have this extra layer on top of like all the teachers, the elders, the craftsmen who are building the house are also gathering every night in the hayloft to discuss who they're going to kill next. And when Kellen returns from his prologue assassination, he discovers this event that has happened while he was gone. Of course, this is happening over the course of thousands of kilometers. You have to ride a horse. So he doesn't have a cell phone. It's not like news of what's happened back home has gotten to him as he's killing this noble. He arrives and discovers that his community is more or less falling apart. And there's, I won't spoil it, but there's a major event that's kind of driven a wedge through a lot of them. And Adam finds himself kind of on the fence as to what to do there. Some of the former assassins have left. They're like, this community is dead. We have to go move on with our lives, try and pick up the pieces elsewhere. Adam initially sticks around because he has this young child from a woman that he is not married to, that he had like a casual fling with, but he's been trying to make it work, and then gets into kind of a fight and decides to just take up and leave and more or less abandon his child. And I like writing, going back to George R.R. Martin, like writing these morally gray characters where not every character is this noble do-gooder. Even Kellen, you mentioned there's racism involved. Like, on the one hand, I wrote him to be like, yeah, he's resisting this conquest dynasty, but there's also a lot of racism and racist undertones that go under there, where even just regular Mongols that are not associated with the military kind of become the source of his ire. And so Adam in particular leaves he's just following in the footsteps of previous assassins who've left, but in doing so he abandons his child and he goes to pursue this woman he has a love interest with, who herself also is kind of a morally gray character. This woman, her name is Moxie, and she has issues with alcoholism, and she knows who Adam is and knows if he's showing up at her door, then he has left his child behind, his young 5-6-year-old child. And yet she still just, enters a relationship with him, which is, maybe not the thing she should be doing. And then they have, the rest of the book goes on and they have their sort of adventures together. But I wanted to kind of show this community falling apart. There's a few other names who get mentioned, George, Josephine, Jess, and Troy, who are mentioned. They don't really get their own chapters. There's I have another book which deals with some of their stories, but I wanted the focal point more or less through Adam to be like, this is what happens when a character leaves this community and is now trying to pick up the pieces of his life as best he can. He is not meant to be a likable character, but I do want people, as you said, to resonate with him, to feel the danger he's in, and to not want him to just be taken out on the roadside.
Yeah, and as I said, I absolutely loved the snapshot into the life of these characters who are not the big players on the stage, but are connected and have their own part to play, perhaps bigger than they realize or bigger than the reader may realize in the overarching, direction of the story. And I want to comment that, and this is kind of more leading to some of the themes I want to talk about, in that when you talk about, very compelling and serious themes like bigotry and racism and intolerance stuff, you're very, I think it's very balanced, extremely balanced, and I have to commend you for that. It's very adroitly handled. Like, because there's racism and bigotry on all sides. There's bigotry for the Mongols towards the white native Australians. There's bigotry for the white native Australians towards the Mongols. As you said, there's bigotry within the Mongols, of the elite, more warrior class. There's all kinds of people making judgments about who and what this person is based on what they do, what their background is, etc. There's again the scorn for some of the illegitimate children, depending on where you are in the hierarchy of illegitimate. Like there's all of these, what I want to say, I call it, people making judgments based on social status, race, class, etc. Was that something that, again, you wanted to purposely portray, and something that you very much saw in the real historical context of the Mongolian steppe conquerors?
A little bit, yes. There's also sexism, which going back to something you mentioned earlier about how the one princess is having these affairs, but is meant to be sort of pure and virginal. Meanwhile, she's surrounded by concubines who are there specifically for sexual services. That is a function of its time, and certainly in the medieval period, women were, especially noble-born princesses, were meant to just be sort of marriage bargaining chips. And I wanted to portray that, and also portray the unfairness of it, and have this particular princess, as well as her sister to an extent, kind of having their own, asserting their own agency and saying, no, this is my life. I'm trying to function within the system, but also this is where the line stops, and where you can't tell me what to do anymore. In terms of sort of the racism and prejudice, there was definitely, in terms of the Chinese, when the Chinese were conquered, there was a lot of prejudice towards the Mongols. And even before that, the Chinese used to refer to the quote unquote barbarians as being either raw or cooked, where they would use the more semi-civilized, in air quotes, barbarians to turn against the less civilized, in air quotes, barbarians. So that was there. The Mongols themselves, when they formed dynasties, they would often keep their language or their history secret from the peasant people that they commanded, in kind of a similar fashion to like medieval Europe, where the nobility treated the serfs as, less than human. You're a workhorse to work for me. So that was there. And again, if you're dealing with this invading conquest dynasty coming into your previously sovereign country, then there's going to be people who resist that, and there's going to be people who, even generations later, will beat on the chest and fly the old flag and be like, oh, this is our country, you should get out. Regardless of how realistic or functional that may be. It's just a function of society as it is. And I think that portraying that was something I wanted to do. I didn't want to have this, despite the shamanic prophecies and whatnot, I didn't want to have something that was too unbelievable. I wanted something that felt more grounded and felt more realistic in terms of how people would actually behave in these situations.
Yeah, no, that's exceptional. It definitely shown through in the work. On that vein, I want to speak about, in general, the topic of colonialism when it comes to, because essentially, this is a new version of, a Mongolian steppe type empire, and it's rife with all the issues and all the positives you might find, if there's positives you can find in essentially a takeover, an empire subjugating, and so you see it's fraught with all these issues. But somewhere in there, I don't think I know nihilism is one of the terms that you talked about in one of the things that's exhibited in the work, but I did see a glimmer of hope. At least I saw in your writing that there were some positives, few as it might seem, because it's a very dark book, and I love dark books like yours. That like, can you talk about this empire in general, this new, dystopian type future empire, and what are the ills that you depicted, but what are the positives, if there are any, that you try to display in the work?
Yeah, for sure. That's again, kind of going back to what actually happened in Mongolian history, where the actual establishment of the Mongol Empire was very brutal and bloodthirsty. But then once it was established, you have free trade, more or less, between West and East. You have Chinese goods flowing into Europe for the first time. You have people able to travel to various noble courts without risk of, roadside banditry or just being taxed to oblivion by some middleman. You have general protections for peasants, and in many cases, like, you have the establishment of like universal education. Like Kublai Khan and his descendants set up this system where every peasant and low-born person was able to get at least a basic, education in reading and writing, which had never happened before. So it was the establishment of the Mongol Empire wasn't just a bloodthirsty, it belongs to those who can take it sort of mentality. There was a aspect of, no, we're going to bring our civilization to the world, and now that we have it, we're going to enrich the world in their own way, which I tried to depict here as well, where you do have this sort of free trade and freedom of religion and sort of like just general base level of uniformity across the world. And also like the chaos of the previous age was abolished by the Mongols. They had brought order to the chaos in much the same way. You could imagine in the sort of the collapse, which is, prelude to this book, you can imagine the whole world acting like a giant failed state where there's no established authority and there's, any regional strongman can just declare himself, a warlord and go on from there. And having this unified state to come in and establish their own order and police their own laws is a benefit in some ways. If I could just mention for a second what you were talking about earlier there about this sort of colonialism, that was an aspect that I was conscious of while writing it, that the Mongols, especially in Australia, I've never been to Australia, but it's kind of similar to here in North America. They're coming in, they're the upper crust of this new society, but they're in many ways not welcome by the inhabitants of that place. And I don't think, I'd have to go back and read, but I don't think there's much of a reference to the actual indigenous Australians throughout this entire thing. So there's a bit of a blind spot with Kellen and some of his cohorts talking about who belongs and who doesn't. And I could just mention my other novel, The Moon Panther, which is a series of prequels and spin-offs to this world, gets a little bit more into sort of the indigenous question that comes up there. I felt that was something that was lacking. So there's layers of sort of colonialism and commentary on like settler colonialism that's happening there.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to read those. Of course, I plan to because clearly, the indigenous people of Australia are famous for on many levels in terms of unfortunately the way they've been persecuted and treated, but also because of the rich culture and traditions that they have, and that despite being oppressed, they've managed to maintain, in the face of in terms of after Europeans. I mean, Australia, of course, started out from the European settlement aspect as being a penal colony, and then as it evolved, unfortunately, like most Western societies, the indigenous people were treated very much horribly and as second-class citizens and persecuted, etc. But it'd be very interesting to read your perspective on all that, on these prequels where we learn more about the indigenous people and how they're placed in this dystopian world that you created. So I can't wait to get to those. So I want to quickly, as we're winding up with themes, just the themes aspect, I want to talk specifically about the concubinage aspect, because you have these in your book, like you said, for the nobles, for the benefit of the male nobles, you've created this ministry that actually, administrates the handling of these courtesans, and the fact that, like you said, potentially you can enter, it's like a business, and you enter as a draft pick, as a rookie, you move your way up, you may or may not get close to the lord that you're serving. However, you're essentially set up for life with this position that you couldn't otherwise, especially came from really humble beginnings. You're going to live way above your means, almost in a dream type job where you may not even have to sleep with if you don't want to do that, you may not even have to sleep with your lord. Of course, for many of these women, that's the aspiration, because if you become favored, that can bring you even more power, prestige, position, wealth, etc. But you're still essentially, indentured. You're still, there's still that element of servitude, and it's. I mean, I feel like what was for me, what was the commentary you were trying to make? I know it was part, of course, you're just expanding on a real life, real world aspect of history with a modern twist. Now you made it very almost corporate, right? What was your commentary? What was behind depicting that in the novel?
The in part it was just tied into the history where, and also in some of the histories, for example, with Genghis Khan, he will, you read these histories where he gets inherits 12,000 new concubines after some conquest, or sometimes they'll translate it as his wives, his new wives, or the mother of his defeated enemy becomes one of his next wives. And these are euphemisms that in modern contexts we would probably not translate as wife. We would probably translate it very differently. And so partly there's commentary on that and adding the sort of the corporate element to it, almost like a, cushy government unionized job where once you're in, you're in. Even if you just don't do anything and you sit on your ass for 40 hours a week, you kind of can't be forced out. There's kind of that element of it there as well, where in some sense it's just salacious and it's fun to write. And then you get to throw in these conniving women like the Empress concubine who really want to make it their own and be like, well, no, I've done this, so I deserve this amount of power. But then there's also just this kind of commentary on, like the implied or sometimes direct unfairness of, now that you've signed your name, now that you're in here, you have certain duties, whether you might like them or not, and you can kind of be booted out at any given time for any reason. And then there's also there's a bit of a threat in there that whenever there's a new Khan elected, even though concubines on paper are the most protected in terms of, no violence of any sort can come to them, whenever there's a new Khan coming to power, there's always these threats of like, well, I control these Amazon guards who are protecting your favorite concubines. And so there's the letter of the law, and then there's the actual kind of political maneuvering behind the scenes.
Yeah, and I very much picked up on that in your novel, and I thought it was it was genius writing in that even within the context of the existence, the day-to-day existence of the concubines, the ones that became favored also became, by virtue of their closeness to their lords, and depending how high their lords were in the hierarchy, really, in some of the cases, very astute and savvy political advisors that were actually influencing policy and decision making. So it was fascinating to see these women who in some ways were powerless because they, with their proximity to power and realizing some of them are quite clever and had good ideas, that these ideas reached the ears of their lords, and their lords are actually acting on them and putting them into policy or making decisions based on what these courtesans, with no other qualifications other than formal qualifications than being courtesans, were actually impacting the course of the government. And I thought that was fascinating. I thought that was really, really well done.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I have to give a kind of a shout out here to Guy Gavriel Kay, Canadian author. One of his books that I absolutely love is Under Heaven, and I was kind of given some inspiration from that. There's a bit in there where the Emperor of China has this favored concubine who is kind of pulling the strings on him and making him enact certain policies that may not be the best for the people, in a way of just kind of enriching her own power. And the actual empress has been kind of gone into seclusion. So there's definitely traces of his influence that go into into sort of the empress concubine and some of her cohorts.
Yeah, well, that's phenomenal. Guy Gavriel, as you mentioned, a phenomenal writer. I have not read Under Heaven. I'm actually going to put a video out in the next few days about my reading of some of 4 of his books that I've read recently. He is amazing. He is an icon, and really fascinating that you took inspiration in one of his books in that element of your work. And again, in your work, it was extremely well done. So I see that influence. And again, and I'm going to put this question up shortly that came up from someone watching the chat. But I do want to comment when you talk about Guy Gabriel Kay. When I talk about Guy Gabriel Kay, the first thing I think about is his phenomenal prose, and your prose is outstanding, Jason. Really, really well done. It's not purple, but yet there's many parts of the book that are just so eloquent and just poetic, and you write fantastic action scenes. Action scenes are great, and but I loved, similar to George R. R. Martin again. I love those quiet moments of simple conversation where you really get those character development moments where you really learn about the characters and what they're all about. And in a very generally fast-paced novel, where again, like I said, like Erickson and Baker, you don't hold people's hand, you kind of throw them in, but you figure things out as you go along. I thought that, I love the prose really kept me immersed and involved in I need that personally. I need that kind of prose. I aspire to write that way to keep people, immersed in the book. And certainly you did that for me with your writing. So,
well, thank you. Yes, I am a bit of a prose snob, and I'm the same way, where I like to read other people's work. And Guy Gabriel Kay is sort of a master at this.
yes.
Under Heaven, I would highly recommend. It's probably my favorite of his books. But I like to just have a level of depth and a level of brevity that keeps you interested, that conveys what's going on without being bogged down in excessive detail or making it read like a textbook, which some authors will do. And it just becomes very tedious to comb your way through that, especially with a book that's 1,200 pages. You don't want to bore people. You want to move the story along and get to the next action scene, the next character scene, the next witty bit of dialogue.
Yeah, no, and definitely, I would be remiss. I'd be remiss if I didn't say it was also very witty. There were lots of moments I was just laughing out loud, especially with some of the footnotes. Man, I was just howling. It was There's a lot to love about your writing, including the humor. So I think you're definitely on that track, that upper level, prose. So yeah, kudos to you on that. I want to put just up this quick question from Brian Beebe. He says, I have a question. My favorite character in Mr. Shannon's writing is Bryant. Are any of the characters in any of your work based on people in your life?
So for legal reasons, no. What he's referring to there is that I have a sort of semi-connected series that I've been toying with. Right now, it's mostly just short stories that follow a completely fictional author in Southern Ontario named Jay Shanahan. And he gets into some misadventures along the way. And I've got a few different short stories now. And one of his sort of friends is Bryant, who, again, for legal reasons, not related to anyone I know.
Okay, well, fantastic. We'll leave it at that. Thank you, Brian, for asking that question. So I do want to, and again, I think we're going to have you back, Jason, to talk more about your work, to talk more about this series and everything involved with Harujin, but also with the rest of your work. But I do want to, while we have time, delve into the other things that you've written. Like, this was phenomenal. Again, I'll be reading everything that you write. But can you tell the readers a bit more about the other things that you've written outside of this universe? You have a new project I think you're working on that's coming recently. Can you talk about your other writing?
Yeah, for sure. So my first book, The Hounds of Harujin, is actually my second book. My first was the Zimmer Insurgency, which has its own very lengthy backstory. But basically, it began as something connected to a larger series. It was just a novella length at the time. And that's actually the one I decided to self-publish rather than pursuing traditional publishing, because of just many years of rejection letters and waiting for the next rejection letter. That's more of a sort of straight down the middle sci-fi thriller. It takes place over the course of about 22 hours. So each chapter kind of begins with like a timestamp. Again, kind of following the same pattern where there's a different point of view character that you follow in each chapter, and then it cycles back. And yeah, and that's much more action oriented. That's much quicker. Some of the chapters are very, very short. Some of them are a little bit longer. The Hounds of Harujin, like I say, became my second book, which I have to repeat again, I was not anticipating being 1,300 pages when I began writing. That was whole new territory for me. And then, as I mentioned already, the Moon Panther is my anthology that connects to the remainder of this series. It basically fills in characters like Josephine. There's a character, she'll be introduced in volume 2 named Penelope. The Empress Concubine kind of gets her own spotlight novella in this. You see like exactly how she wields power and how she gains her influence. And there's reference to like some of the desert banditry going on. So it just kind of paints more of a picture as to the world in shorter increments where you don't need to delve in. And I should mention, you do not need to read the Hounds of Harujin to read the Moon Panther, or vice versa. They're designed completely as standalones so that you can sample your way in whichever way you want. Another book of mine is Rain's Agenda. This one is, again, just pure science fiction. It's kind of thriller based. I call it like techno thriller. Idea here is that the artificial uterus has been created to liberate women from pregnancy, but then there is a terrorist group that wants to destroy it. It's actually a little bit shorter. It's about 70,000 words, so 200-ish pages. So it's, again, a fast read. It's narrated first person, which I actually am doing a lot of first person narration these days. It's limiting in some regards because you're stuck with that character and what they see, but it also just allows you to be more intimate with who they are, to better develop their sense of themselves, sometimes to just have like a more unique take on the dialogue and the prose, and fill in some of the backstory in a more unique way. Recently, well, last year, I came out with The Rise and Fall of Chaz Oregano. This is like novella length. It's about 150 pages. And this is technically in the same universe as the Hounds of Harujin. There'll be reference to different princes at the top of things, but looking back, maybe I should have just divorced the whole thing, because it has really no connection to like the larger shamanic prophecy. It's more of a political thing. I'm kind of classing it as young adult these days because it's just easier to market that way. And my new project, which I believe someone mentioned in the comics as well, Tiger Blues. Now this is coming out next year. This is breaking the mold entirely. This is not science fiction. It's steampunk. Sort of alt history, takes place in 1948 in Tibet. And there's like airships, and there's like laser weapons, like laser swords and laser AK-47s and whatnot going on. And, there's a little bit of fantasy elements in terms of different myths and legends that may or may not be, real in actual life. So that one, you can follow me on social media or join my mailing list, and there'll be lots of updates there. I'm just going through the first edit on it now. Needs a lot of work, but that's one. Oh, and I should mention too, like for anyone who's into like more inclusive writing, this one, Tiger Blues, follows like 2 trans characters, which are real people from history. And I shouldn't call them trans. They were either trans or non-binary, or something in that umbrella, which I'm not going to assign a gender to them. But I pair them up for this story and kind of send them on like, the adventurer's quest to find this mystical MacGuffin type item. And and I kind of just get to write in, a very like queered media type fashion. So it's a lot of fun doing that.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Well, I guess I have a lot of Jason Shannon reading ahead of me, which excites me. Those all sound fantastic. I can't wait to get them. Obviously, TBRs our lists are long, but wow, I know that, I'm going to be spending some years, I'm sure, reading the things that you write. We haven't even delved in, and again, we're going to have you back in the future. We haven't really delved into Jason Shannon, the person, like how you got started in writing, what made you want to write all these amazing books, what your background is in terms of writing, if you pursued that in school. Like, can you talk a bit about that, about yourself in that aspect?
Yeah, of course. So I grew up in Belleville, Ontario, which is kind of halfway-ish between Toronto and Kingston, and small town. It's is actually a little bit larger these days, but it had a very small town feel when I was there. And there was a small town bookstore, which I believe is defunct now, for sadly. And I remember being in that bookstore one day, and when I was a teenager, I really only liked science fiction. That was kind of all I read, and found myself at their very small science fiction section, read the back of, the synopsis on the back of one book, which I could just tell was summarizing the first 2/3 of the book in the first two paragraphs. And I'm like, so now I already know what happens for the first 150 pages. And I just happened to remark to myself, like, I could write a better book than this. And I think I was 13, 14 at the time, and kind of set to work on writing something at the time. I kind of tried to base it in like in English class assignment when I became something else, and never finished that one. And of course, it's, teenagers work, so it's not very good. But that was kind of the beginning for me, where I really fell in love with the idea of telling my own story, of building out my own worlds, of writing my own action sequences, and kind of like living vicariously through the page to a certain extent. And as I mentioned, one of my first novels, which I wrote just after college, I didn't go to college for creative writing. I intended to go to York University, for they have a creative writing program there, but through issues with the application process and AOL classifying it as spam and me not discovering it until the last minute, I wound up not going, and went to trade school instead, because I work in construction in my day job. That's a long story, but yeah, right after college, I wound up finishing one of, what I sometimes call my first novel, which again is unpublished. Tried to circulate that around to traditional publishers and agents for many years. Back in those days, you would submit, you would send this one-page query letter, which would summarize your book, and then you'd wait 8 months for them to reject you, and they would say, do not send this to anyone else while we're waiting to reject you. So it becomes very disheartening. I did that for a number of years until I decided to publish The Zimmer Insurgency, which I did because it was finished. It was something that, because of the length, because of the genre, because of other things, was not going to be accepted by a traditional publisher. And I thought, I'll do a quick edit, and then put it out, self-publish. My aunt had given me a newspaper article on a self-publishing company called Lulu, which I used for the first one, and basically haven't looked back from there. I started going to different book shows, to different vendor events, very scattershot in the first few years as I was still learning things. Social media, website, again, all very scattershot in those first few years, is not exactly my forte. And yeah, basically just kept going from there. I have a lot of fun doing it. I love meeting other authors in this space. I love meeting readers and potential readers and chatting with them. And it's just, haven't gone back.
Well, that's incredible, and I know, having been with your trade show, you sell very well at these shows. Clearly, a popular author, in terms of doing that, and perhaps, while I hadn't seen you, a lot of your presence on social media. Now that I am following you on social media, and I'm seeing what great stuff you do there, and I can I expect you and your writing to only become more recognized and more appreciated as time goes on. I would say it's definitely underappreciated now, but I think that's going to be a short-term thing as more and more people learn about your writing and how talented you are. So, but I think, as we're winding down, I do want to, and we're going to have you back, because there's so many things I want to ask, though, so many things we didn't cover. So I hope you'll do me the honor of coming back on the show at a future date.
Of course.
We could talk about more in depth about a lot more your work and more in depth about you, but at least we had this opening. I do want to give you the opportunity to tell people, where to find you on social media, where to buy your books, if there's availability to get author signed copies from you, where you tend to hang out the most on social media, things like that. Anything you want to add in terms of people being able to find out about Jason Shannon, find out about your writing, and buy your books.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll definitely come back to chat some more. This has been a lot of fun. My best way to follow what all is going on and learn about my books is my website, jasonmshannon.com. I have a website store there, so you can get ebooks, and I have a number of audiobooks available now as well. which actually, if you get them from my website store, comes with a special bonus scene that is only available there and not on the Audible version. But of course, they're on Audible as well, and Kobo, and any other audiobook website. As for the ebooks, again, Kobo, Kindle, Smashwords, formerly Smashwords. I think it's been bought up by another company now. In terms of the paperbacks, Amazon, I don't have those listed on my website, but if someone wants one, feel free to reach out by email. My email is listed there. I'm happy to send you one. The reason I just don't list it on the website is because I don't, if I am working, if I am out of the country, if I have issues, I don't want to like have a order waiting to be filled for a week and a half that the customer is like, well, where is this? So just feel free to reach out, and when I see it, I will gladly send you whatever you prefer. Yeah, I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all of them just at Harujin's Hounds. Connection through the find me bar, follow me bar on my website. I tend to spend the most time on Instagram, but you can get me on any of the rest of them. Twitter these days is probably the least active of my social media, just because it's a bit of a pain to upload stuff there and whatnot. So yeah, feel free to follow me there, and also join my mailing list if you want to stay up to date. I have a mailing list. The button should be right there on the homepage of my website, and I don't spam your email with a whole bunch of updates on I wrote 15 words last month. I only put out stuff for new releases or for important messages, important updates and whatnot. So that is the best place where it doesn't get buried in algorithms. You're not going to miss it because Facebook decided to punish me because I didn't give them ad money this month. You're going to find it on my mailing list.
Fantastic, and thank you for providing all the information, Jason. And just so everyone who's watching this live or who watch the replay, the links to most of Jason's social media, etc., are in the description for the video, so you can go directly there. And of course, he's provided them to you just now. So, Jason, it has been so phenomenal to talk to you. I've looked forward to this for so long. I'm lucky because we're both Canadian authors, and I'll get to see you in person at other shows and stuff like that. But I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and being willing to come and chat to me today for around an hour and a half and talk about your work. And I think hopefully there'll be a lot more people grabbing your work, because it's absolutely phenomenal. And I certainly will continue to spread the word to anyone who will listen about how great your writing is and how wonderful your books are. So, and I'm looking forward to reading much more from you in the future.
Well, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to chat with you as well. And it really is pleasurable to just have another accomplished author have read my work and to give me such kind words on the prose and the pacing and the character development and everything I was trying to go for. You seem to have picked up on, which is great to hear.
Well, that's because you put it out there. So again, I've been honored to read your work. And again, it was one of my top reads this year. And I'm only surprised because you before, but now I have. So quickly for me, P.L. Stewart, the John Kingdom Saga 7847. That is my YouTube channel where you're watching this live with the wonderful Jason Shannon. The books, the John Kingdom Saga, 4 books currently published, the 5th one coming out, A Pack of Wolves, in 2025. Anything you want to learn about the John Kingdom Saga, the website is www.plstewart.com. Like Jason, I'm on most of the big social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, Twitter X, whatever you want to call it, Blue Sky, Facebook. The handles are usually at P.L. Stewart Writes. Of course, I'm also an assistant editor with the wonderful Before We Go blog and led by the incredible Beth Tabler. So shout out to Beth Tabler and all of the Before We Go blog peeps. Some wonderful people there. So if you want to get a hold of me, those are the places where you can reach me. Also see my reviews on Before We Go blog and Goodreads. And again, if you check out my posts for top Indian trad books for 2024 that I read, you will see Hounds of Harujin on that list, because it was just that good and it made that much of an impact on me. So check out Jason's work. It is absolutely phenomenal. You want to find a new favorite? I think if you read his stuff, you're probably going to find one. So quickly, last question I'll entertain. Brian Levy asked, around what time of year next year is Tiger Blues coming out? And I'll let Jason answer that.
I'm aiming for around June because June is Pride Month, and as I mentioned, the two trans and/or non-binary, genderqueer protagonists, I felt that was a good time of year to bring that out. There is actually, I have a decent amount of readership that is in the sort of the LGBT space. My earlier book, The Zimmer Insurgency, also kind of touches on LGBT rights a little bit. So I'm aiming for June. It is still in its very first draft at this point, and I just finished reading it. It needs a little bit of work, and by a little bit I mean a lot. So stay tuned for that. But I'm aiming for June.
Thanks very much for giving us that, Jason. When it's coming out, sounds exciting. Congratulations on the impending release. I want to thank quickly everyone in the chat who came by. Central Salamander, Brian Beebe, and anyone who was watching but simply didn't comment, who's watching the live, and also anyone who will watch the replay later. It's because of you that makes this type of long form content awesome. And thank you so much for supporting Jason as the author, because again, he is phenomenal as a person and a writer. So that wraps up the second of 3 6 elemental interviews today. So I hope if you're around, you tune in for the third one later at 1 p.m. But this was amazing to spend some time with Jason for the last approximately hour and a half. He's willing. He said he will come back one day. I'm going to hold him to that. So I hope he's willing. And it was amazing to chat to him. And once again, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye now, everyone.